Hello, James.
Hi, Leslie.
Well, it's really nice to speak with you today.
You as well. Thanks for having me.
You have the greatest name for a counselor.
Yeah, thank you. That's it's always an initial subject of conversation. Um,
Yeah,
and I
people
would,
probably doubt it.
yeah, a lot of times people don't think it's my real name. They think maybe it's kind of like I use it as a just to say what I do, or it's like a
Oh,
stage
yeah,
name or something. But no, it's my actual name,
James Counselor.
James Counsellor.
Well, thank you so much for reaching out to me for this discussion. You you contacted me after watching some of the videos that I've posted and mentioned that you had also been trained at Antioch, New England, but
Yeah.
quite a while back. I mean, well, not maybe quite a while back, but some years back before maybe it was before the landscape was what it is now.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about your experiences there and your experiences watching what's happened since, and also just how what your thoughts are on how things have developed in this field over the time that you've been practicing. So, would you kind of introduce yourself and when you went to school and what got you into it and what your thoughts are? It's just a really bunch of vague questions there.
Sure. Well, yeah. So I went to Antioch, New England, in New Hampshire, um, between 2001 and I graduated in 2003. Um, at the time, I was living and working in Vermont, which is just across the river, and um, in a small private liberal arts college. And I'd been interested in psychology, counseling, therapy. You know, when I was younger, I started reading books on philosophy and Carl Jung, and a lot of different things that people probably recognize. And the situation was that there was this school across, a few miles down the road that had a master's degree program in counseling psychology. And I knew a variety of people in the area that had gone through it since, a large percentage of the therapists in New England have some association with Antioch.
Mm.
And so I applied, got in, and that's kind of how it all started. I also have a family history of besides my name, other people who have been in the counseling profession as well. So that's kind of how I got there. Um, yeah. So, and when I arrived, Antioch was and is, a very kind of liberal type of institution. Um, and, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's, there's the Horace Mann quote, be ashamed to die until you've won some victory or
Mm.
for mankind. And so it's
Mm.
always kind of had a sort of activist, I didn't think of it in those terms, but always kind of you know, um, a socially oriented mission or conception of itself.
Mm.
And, but again, at the time, that wasn't something that I thought much about or knew much about, or was probably more sympathetic to in a way,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
It does. And it's interesting because it does sound like it still doesn't strike me as necessarily nefarious.
No, it didn't strike me as nefarious either. Um, and I don't think anybody involved necessarily had any nefarious kind of intent, of course.
Mhm.
Um, the it was more practical than anything in the sense that the emphasis in Antioch's programs then and perhaps now, although I'm not sure, was really, you know, getting out of the theory and into the work. And
Mm.
and that was the essence of the training. I mean, we did more uh, kind of in placement hours than
Mm.
most other programs.
Mm.
So
So a lot of skills training.
a lot of skills training, a lot of mentoring. That was a big part of
Mm.
it through your supervisors in your various placements.
Mhm.
Um, so, as an applied psychology program or an applied allied mental health program, that was really the emphasis. And I was quite good at it. I
Mhm.
think the training was pretty good.
Mm. Yeah, I found the skills training to still be good when I was, recently there.
Yeah.
Um, I went to the Seattle campus first, and then I transferred to the online program. But while I was at the Seattle campus, the skills training was excellent. The We had plenty of time for individual work and then groups, and even the online program did a pretty good job of managing that aspect of things. And that's one of the things that I've kind of grappled with, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like how much of it's crude metaphor, but how much of a turd in the punch bowl is the woke stuff, or the social justice training. And it quite is. It was enough for me to eventually say I had to pull back from it. But I do think that I gained good skills. I do think that I learned something of value. And so that's something I'm kind of wrestling with. When people ask me, uh, as students, is it worth going to a counseling program? I think, well, it's not worth not going, but what you're getting is, I'm not sure what you're getting right now. Anyway.
Yeah. The only parallel I can think off the top of my head would be, let's say you were going to college in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you were a conservative Christian, and
Mm-hmm.
you were going to a state university.
Mm-hmm.
You'd run into a predominantly liberal, fairly conventionally liberal academic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And while it might not be like overtly hostile, it wouldn't necessarily be particularly sympathetic to your view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, that whole script is kind of flipped. And in the sense that the woke thing is kind of like become, it is my in my to my understanding of it, it's kind of become like a hostile environment to people with more traditionally liberal views.
Mm-hmm.
Not,
Mm-hmm.
conservative Christians notwithstanding. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a strange sort of turn of events, but like a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things, it's hard to see the forest for the trees when you're in the middle of it.
So it sounds like you didn't experience it as an oppressive uh, social justice climate while you were in school, at least back in the early 2000s.
No, I mean, I don't think it was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think my own predilections at the time were probably more, conventionally liberal myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I didn't have any like fundamental objections to it. And I also wasn't necessarily enough of a historian of academia and the sort of philosophical trends within it to kind of have a real good handle on what was going on, maybe behind the
Yeah.
scenes.
Yeah.
But on a day-to-day level, no, it wasn't that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it
So
was,
you graduated in 2003,
yeah.
and did you start practicing right away?
Well, yeah, there's a whole story to that. I mean, fairly soon, as soon as I graduated, I actually traipsed off to India for a period of time.
Hmm. Oh,
Um,
cool.
and then when I
Interesting.
came back, yeah, and then when I came back, I looked around and ended up getting held a job for a fairly short time out in the community mental health in the Vermont system.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then eventually made my way back to Michigan. So, so yeah, so I've been, and then I also kind of took a detour into, I was a pretty serious student of yoga for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
then got into various kinds of alternative kinds of modalities of health healing body work, which took me out to Colorado. So I kind of had a sort of a out of the ordinary path that I was
Mm-hmm.
on the hunt for something. I didn't exactly know what I was looking for, but
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of following this path of trying to. The counseling was sort of oriented on the mental and psychological and the
Mm-hmm.
emotional, and then I was kind of interested. Well, how do I tie that into the body,
Mm-hmm.
which had been important to me in a personal sense in terms of my own process.
Mm-hmm.
and this kind of thing wasn't unheard of back then, but it wasn't so common,
Mm-hmm.
so I kind of didn't know what I was doing, but I was kind of just following my interests and kind of what seemed like the right thing to do at the time.
So you took some time to do some exploration and have taken time to do some exploration and develop this other area of interest that comes along parallel with the work you're doing as a counselor, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, you could probably call it, within the realm of like somatic psychology or
Mm-hmm.
somatics.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily like attending a specific program with that name, but that's the sort of pursuit it was.
And that's becoming more popular now, it
Yeah,
seems.
yeah,
So there's a
it
growing
seems.
awareness of mind body connection and
Hmm.
how we can ground ourselves into our bodies to be more present and more aware of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, the whole phenomenon of embodiment, I guess, would be
Mm-hmm.
the word that people use.
Mm-hmm.
And, what's that mean, and how does that relate to one's sense of identity, which is
Mm-hmm.
a phrase of the moment, and uh, and what happens perhaps if one doesn't have that.
Mm-hmm. So as you've done this, have you observed a change in tone and in the culture around things like activism and social justice? And what's that been like from your perspective?
Well, it's interesting because I would sort of count myself as an observer,
Mm-hmm.
a participant observer, kind of like the old anthropology experiments. And and where I'm at in the kind of, you know, communities that I've been around for the last several years are sort of they're sort of on the outskirts of the cultural conversation,
Mm.
but they're not removed entirely from it. And so I think the mental health industry, the field, the uh, the various fields involved in it probably are, you know, in my opinion, it seems like they're kind of the fruits that are being born right now are probably the result of several years of been going on in academia and training programs
Mhm.
over the last couple decades, probably particularly since the 2000s.
Mm.
And it's a sort of larger shift in the culture in some ways, and it's spreading. But I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think it's limited to these fields. However, it is in some sense um, probably most visible in these fields.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And what does that look like on a practical level for you or from your perspective as an observer?
Well, you know, during the whole COVID era, we had some of the same things that you hear about up here, which is, people upset at school board meetings and, and of course, sounds like I'm shifting topics, but I think there's a certain kind of continuity.
Hmm.
And and I think one of the things that one of the things that you see looking around is just a fairly, I'd say gradual, but I'm not sure it's that gradual kind of distrust in institutions.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I think if you live out in the boondocks, even here, people self-monitor a little more than they used to
Hmm.
about what they say or don't say.
Hmm.
You know, everybody has Twitter and TikTok and Facebook, so all of the
Hmm.
stuff that is going on in the kind of social media conversation is available everywhere. So I think that changes things as much as anything.
So like a self-censorship and political correctness.
Yeah, I mean that's not exactly new, but it's
Hmm.
but it's more pervasive.
And do you see that more just in the culture at large and in everyday meetings with people, or is this particularly happening in your work as a counselor?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I think in my work as a counselor, I would hope that people feel free to speak freely,
Mm-hmm.
and I would, encourage that. I think, but yeah, I mean, for sure, there's the one of the things that's particularly noticeable is the change in language and emphasis when it comes to things like professional organizations, continuing education,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not just talking nationally, but at the state level and
Mm-hmm.
locally. Um, so,
Like the types of course offerings and the direction that you're receiving from the professional organizations.
well, yeah, I mean, I think the professional organizations are, as far as I can tell,
Mm-hmm.
um, main drivers of some of the ideological shifts,
Mm-hmm.
and and I suppose they're also responsive to outside, other influences, including their membership. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, so if you look at any kind of, you get a brochure, an email for, any kind of conference anywhere. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
the all of the elements that you might kind of call social justice or
Mm-hmm.
um, so forth are all built into it mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're central to it. Sometimes they're kind of like an additional,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
class or something. And so that's a noticeable change.
Mm-hmm. You sort of vacillated around the word gradual. And I wonder about that too, because it does seem it it seems like it's hard to it's like we're talking about this stuff kind of vaguely, but there is a vagary to it. And I've it seemed like it kind of crept in gradually in some ways. Like there were people who were primed to accept this way of thinking from maybe trainings that they'd received in high school or college. And then by the time they got to graduate school, they were ready to accept it more readily versus people who had taken a break. So I put myself in that category. I hadn't been exposed to academia for about a decade. When I came back in, it did seem like there was something markedly different. Like this really stood out to me as, oh, interesting. We're talking about the world in a very different way. The um social psychology seems like it's set up very differently than I remember learning about back when I was an undergrad. So from your perspective, did you feel like there was a punctuated time when this became really salient to you, or is it both? Is it both gradual and punctuated? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. There's an old joke. How did you go broke? And
Hmm.
slowly at first, then all at once.
Oh wow,
Um,
that's great.
so um, I don't really know. I think
Mm-hmm.
being of the Gen Xer variety,
Mm-hmm.
I think that so I'll come back to that in a second. One of the things I think that's interesting about people roughly our age is not only do we remember what we're the last people who are going to ever remember what the world was like before the internet,
Yeah,
and we're the last people who physiologically developed into adulthood before the influence of the internet.
yeah.
And so I think you could probably point to 2007. I think it was when the iPhone was
Mm.
introduced.
Mm.
as when the technology began to
Something
facilitate the
shifted.
transformation.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. The way that technology corresponds to this.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, I haven't really thought it out exactly, although there's a general idea that technology is neutral. It only depends on what you do with it, which is true to an extent.
Hmm.
But
Well, there's process and content, right? So, like the
yeah,
technology itself, by introducing a new process of engagement, regardless of necessarily what the content is going to shift things to some degree, right?
yeah, for sure. I mean,
Hmm.
it it changes the parameters
Mm-hmm.
of what's possible, at least in terms of process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so kind of coming back to the issue of like embodiment, for example, one of the things that I think is interesting is like, and I didn't necessarily come up with this idea myself, but I've been kind of thinking about it, which is that how much of this, how much of the controversies that we're all embroiled in the midst of are primarily linguistic.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Mm-hmm.
language and conceptual controversies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, their relationship to the really real world, something you can touch and feel outside of yourself, is sometimes peripheral. And
Mm-hmm.
even though I'd argue that they're central. So, you know, when you're having a debate about, it's like debating the, it's like having a discussions about unicorns and horses. We could talk about these things and have a great discussion about unicorns and horses, and the representation in literature and history of the horse, and how unicorns behave, and it might be a lot of fun, and at the same time, at the end of the day, there's a pertinent issue, which
Mm-hmm.
is one thing is real and one thing is not.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the issue of embodiment, as it relates to this whole thing, kind of touching back on what we were speaking of, is that it's very central to it, as is the opposite, disembodiment. And there's something about the technology that has changed that,
Mm.
in my opinion. And I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but it just seems obvious.
That's really interesting. I think that's a really good way to frame it, because it's like the spending a lot of time on the internet, on social media, for instance. It's both intensely social and very isolating at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that it seems like it can it's like filling your social needs with junk food, stuffing yourself with something that's non-nutritive, but still fills you up. So you can end up socially exhausted and without the drive to go and make in-person contact,
Yeah.
but without having actually done anything that is substantive in terms of human connection.
Yeah. It's a type of sensory deprivation,
Mm,
um, in the sense that um, you're having a relationship and an interaction of sorts, of course.
mhm,
Um, but it's almost entirely linguistic
mhm,
and electronic image based.
mhm,
Um, so hypothetically, you might wonder, well, how does that affect people's development? Not only
mhm,
as kids, but as adults. Um, what does it change?
mhm.
And a lot of people point out that, people say stuff on the internet that they never say to anybody in real life.
Right.
Although maybe that's changing, but
Mm,
and and it's because the social environment is um, mediated through technology,
mhm.
and if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's really the piece that you added that I've never thought about is to think about it in terms of embodiment.
Hmm.
And that's really interesting because that bridges the gap toward to into the conversation about transhumanism and
Huh. Yeah,
technology and how it relates to the changing of what it means to be a human being.
yeah, I think that's a good point. And yeah, the whole subject of transhumanism is kind of central to the um, cultural, I don't know what you want to call it, debate at the moment. I'm not sure it's a debate, kind
I
of
don't know what
debate.
it is. It's a war.
It's kind of like a food fight.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what it is.
but
Yeah.
yeah, transhumanism, or uh, which is a sort of a allegory of postmodernism, maybe.
Mm.
Um,
Will you
and
say more about that? That's interesting.
well, I mean, I'm not an academic, although I like to read academic stuff. But when you get down to it, postmodernism, I mean, you could just plain English, it's kind of like everything's relative, right? Um, except the statement everything's relative, but that's so. And transhumanism is the idea that, well, how would I say it? Obviously, I don't know if there's a definition, but everything's self-referential. In other words, there's nothing outside of yourself that would be considered there's no solid ground, to use the name of your channel, and so not only can you not only is everything relative, but nothing is certain. And in a sense, then everything is up for grabs, including what it means to be human. I mean, I think it's fair to say that most of the psychology and so on that we've been familiar with was kind of came out of the humanistic kind of movements, right? The goal was the full realization of human potential, kind of a 1960s type of phrase. And transhumanism would seem to suggest that embodiment is kind of an oppressive limitation. And in that sense, it's unjust. And that technology then is a mechanism for righting that injustice.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's it. It's I guess I have so many questions that I don't know how to answer them in my mind, and I don't know how to make sense of them. So like transhumanism, the way that you're describing it, is sort of like this corruption of individualism in a way. Or how is it different from individualism? Because the technocratic disembodied transhumanism has a very collectivist feel to it at the same time that it's celebrating the ultimate individuality or individual determinism. So and I'm kind of struggling to articulate this, but it seems like there's somewhere that these concepts are meeting and somewhere where they're in opposition. Self-determinism, the ability to remake ourselves, the freedom from our embodiment. And yet it's kind of like the difference between individuality and intersectionality, where if you follow intersectionality to its logical conclusion, you get the individual, but you get it through, it's like a pixelated individual instead of a full rounded living individuality, which is not made up of segments and categories, but rather of something more fluid. I don't know if anything I just said made sense, but it was it's just a lot of thoughts.
I'm kind of stealing a phrase that I heard Mary Harrington, the English author, say, but she uses the term unchosen obligations. So, in other words, I don't know exactly what individuality means, but it seems bounded by the traditional parameters of how one would conceive of an individual. And I think that but at the same time, an individual is not necessarily self-created. There's an aspect of your individuality which is received from those who came before you, right? So the intersectionalists have a point, which is that you are in a sense embedded in contexts. Kind of like the old idea of holons, holes within, parts of holes within greater holes, all sort of, kind of like a Russian doll forever and ever. So yeah, well, I think the thing about transhumanism, or at least the way it sort of seems, is that there's this sort of sense that the any unchosen obligation, whether it's to the past, to biology, to the community, to
Mm-hmm.
what have you, is a potential obstacle to um, this other kind of true individuality or freedom, freedom from all constraints, freedom from all hierarchies.
Like limitations are necessarily oppressive.
Limitations are impressive. Unchosen limitations are oppressive, but I guess that's sort of a, maybe that's the same thing.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, conveniently enough, there's a rapidly expanding industry which promises all sorts of ways to free you from those limitations. Um,
Medical.
Medical, technical,
Mm.
biomedical,
Mm-hmm.
um, and and there's always product. So
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, in a sense, you could also look at this as like a market creation, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like expanding your market base.
So is it just the logical um, progress of capitalism?
I don't know. I don't know if it's logical, but it's progress of capitalism, and
Mm-hmm.
and or something like that. And yeah, it's hard to disentangle a lot of these kinds of issues from the financial incentives involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can't. I don't know.
So as you see it, what are your concerns or predictions, or what, how do you feel like we're being immediately impacted in a maybe a positive or a negative way by all these forces?
Geez, I don't know about predictions.
Okay.
Well, I think that probably the truest thing I could say is I don't know, and probably nobody else does either.
Mm-hmm.
But but I enjoy the Educated Guess project,
Mm-hmm.
and I suspect that, well, there's also the perspective that um, we're all kind of actors in the course of ordinary history. And as much as we think everything is unprecedented and we're kind of at the leading edge of whatever's going on, that maybe that's probably not really the case.
Mm-hmm.
And that in many ways, what is happening socially at the moment is a reflection of things that have happened before many times and will keep happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
Like the spiral arc of history.
yeah, the spiral arc of history. And I think that well, you can already kind of see what's happening, at least what appears to be happening in terms of political attitudes, which is to say that people tend to be fracturing into various kinds of uh, camps.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
It's
and
tribal.
there's a certain kind of tribalism
Mm-hmm.
reemerging,
Mm-hmm.
which probably wasn't very far beneath the surface. And I think I don't know how you quantify it, but the energy in holding together a very complicated, heterogeneous kind of society and culture is significant, and
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't just happen by itself. So when the ties that bind people together begin to fray, it doesn't take very long before it unravels.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens next, I don't know. Um, Hopefully nothing drastic, but uh, I think in some ways, coming back to just like say mental health,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I suppose one thing that may happen in an arena like that is people kind of like decide that what they are or are not going to agree with, what they are or are not going to, maybe how they are or are not going to work with clients if they
Mhm.
are fundamentally opposed to,
Mhm.
uh, something which not only would they might consider to be personally offensive, but more might violate their sense of professional ethics, for example. Then I could see that there maybe there emerges alternative or parallel professional associations, training programs. I don't know.
Mhm.
It's hard to say, but that's a possibility.
So, yes, the idea of alternative and parallel associations, that's coming up a lot, as you pointed out earlier, a lot of the change seems to be coming down through the professional organizations. And this changes the landscape and it changes the pressures on practitioners.
Mm.
And so for yourself, do you see a point at which you will have to consider whether to continue practicing under your license, or does that feel like it's not at risk right now?
I don't perceive it to be at risk. Um, Maybe I'm naive. I don't, I think, um, I think that, well, people who have people who are licensed by the state to practice some profession, whether it's medicine or counseling or whatever, I mean, that's a fairly significant responsibility. And
Mhm.
one of the reasons that I thought, well, one of the reasons that I thought maybe, that it'd be worthwhile to begin talking some more publicly about these kinds of things is that by and large, even though, we might be, immersed in these kinds of discussions, by and large, most people either A, aren't aware of them, or B, don't quite understand what it's all about.
Mhm.
Um, and why should they?
Mhm.
So, I think that professional people have a responsibility to say something or do something when it's appropriate. Um, because, and one of the things, I mean, this is true everywhere, but particularly if you live and work in kind of rural areas, what you say, what you do, your opinion, these kind of things have a lot of influence.
Mhm.
Um, and, like it or not. And so, if somebody takes their kid into some therapist or some doctor and they diagnose them with something and recommend that they do XYZ, I mean they're probably more often than likely going to do it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you know so I mean, we don't work in medicine, but there's the old first do no harm thing, which is you know and that's important. And I think that um as a professional person, when you're dealing with kind of like some of the more uh, you know controversial aspects of what's going on in that affect our work days,
Mhm.
um, at some point you have to either decide
Mhm.
I'm just going to keep my mouth shut and go along, or I'm going to say something if it doesn't sit right with me, and I feel like something needs to be said.
Mhm.
So, and that's hard to do, right? I mean, it's hard to do because, well, most
Mhm.
people don't like conflict, particularly therapists. So
Yeah, it's taking a risk for sure.
yeah, it's taking a risk.
Mhm.
And but there's also risk in not taking risks. And
Mhm.
there's a risk either way. And what's the bigger risk?
So how are you balancing that in your professional life right now? Is it something that's coming up much, or are you, is it mostly peripheral to the work that you're doing?
Um on a day-to-day basis, I would say it's somewhat peripheral. um, you know, in the work that I do, I don't feel any particular pressure
Mhm.
to, do something. Well, I don't feel any ideological pressure to do
Mm.
something that I might not agree with. And, um, so in that sense, of course, I can only speak for myself, but, so yeah, how to answer the question? I guess, I'm concerned about the directions in the larger sense of things.
Mhm.
And, I think that, so that's kind of the perspective I take.
Mhm.
And I think that to the degree that, stuff kind of begins to sort of, sift down and filter down into local communities and stuff, and then it might be important to, be more direct. But
Mhm.
does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. It's in the way that you pointed out that the licensed professional kind of wears this mantle of authority that
Yeah.
is, for better or for worse, as you say, influential. And we're seeing this this new cohort of very ideologically trained
Hmm.
counselors coming into the field, and we know what the trainings consist of, and we know that there's a pressure to influence people in a certain direction, a very specific direction that seems to run counter to long-standing notions of mental health in some ways, in some important ways. So
Yeah.
that is, it sounds like that's where your concern really is about where this is going and the influence that this can have.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've taken away from listening to some of what you've put out there and the conversations you had is the real difference in terms of, how, people are being trained and how they think of what they do.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, you know, I mean, like everybody's, a common sort of tagline is, becoming an agent of change, let's say,
Yeah, yeah,
you
that
know,
was explicitly told to us
right.
that we would be agents of change.
Yeah. And it was sort of like, kind of vague way that kind of sounds kind of good, kind of like, well, okay,
Yeah,
people
yeah,
are
change people's lives for the better, help
change
people.
people's lives for the
Yeah,
better, right? You
yeah,
know,
but for the better of what and whom?
right. And the emphasis is not so much on even changing the person's life for the better. It's kind of the person is uh, a tool
Right.
for, um, you know, other kinds of change.
Yep, yep.
And so at that point, that's when, I think it's like put the brakes on.
Yeah, I've heard it described as a client or a patient as a clinical opportunity to do something else in the world,
Yeah.
which
That's
is really shocking from a like an individual psychotherapy kind of perspective, to see that person as a thing to be used in order to influence some other thing.
right.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you're not so much a therapist as you are some sort of, secular missionary.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
I don't know if secular is the right word there, but
Yeah.
something like that.
Hmm.
And, and, that's fine if
Hmm.
that's what
If
they've
that's
signed
what
up.
that person wants and knows.
Right.
Right.
But mostly that's not what they've signed up for.
No, it seems like a giant bait and switch.
Yeah. And, yeah, and that in some sense is just, in my opinion, fundamentally unethical.
Hmm.
Um, Not to mention dishonest.
Hmm.
And I think one of the hardest things about doing therapy is figuring out, you know, because you're a person, you've got on, your own beliefs and thoughts and prejudices and whatever
Hmm.
else it is that makes you up. And and that's not your client's business, you know and it's not your business to necessarily convince them of anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I don't know. That seems to be a old-fashioned attitude.
It's definitely being done differently now.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think I'm like everybody else. I'm kind of just part of the reason it's interesting to talk about it and have a dialogue about these things is because I'm just like everyone else, kind of working my way through it as it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
uh, so what comes next? I don't know.
Well, I believe personally that the dialogue is important because through engaging with these things honestly and without intimidation and without the pressure of self-censorship and political correctness, to just actually have a discussion about what it means, while it feels kind of clumsy, I think that it's kind of the antidote to the the suppressive mystique of all of this, and the pure pressure and this and the pressure from above, the pressure from the side, the pressure from below, to keep in line with a certain like silent acquiescence that seems to be
Yeah.
at the heart of maintaining this.
Yeah. I sort of have thought that um, even though I don't equate my current situation with anything historically as extreme as, some of the, more uh, oppressive kind of societies or something from the past. But I kind of wonder if this isn't what it feels like a little bit,
Mm,
you know,
mhm.
like the time and the place is different and the situation is different, but there's something similar about the feeling of it,
Yeah, I
you
mean, it
know.
certainly is strange to experience a whole population coming under sort of a spell where they can't speak openly.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that could probably be said about that. I mean, I think yeah, there's something about you could theorize that there's something about human beings which um, how did someone say it? The idea was that people are they're kind of religious thinkers by nature,
Hmm.
absent of any particular religion.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the kind of idea is, well, if there's a vacuum in that regard, something will come to fill it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't know why I keep coming up with all of these old sayings today, but there's another one which is something like, in general, don't deconstruct a fence until you know why the previous guy built it.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is to say that boundaries between things and definitions of things and ways of doing things are were all solutions to problems that you don't even remember.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
And to change them could be the unraveling of something that you don't predict.
yeah, and the idea goes on that, take away all of those things and the problems come back.
Hmm. Hmm.
Maybe in slightly different formulations, but the essence of them is the same.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, the idea that you can't say stuff,
Hmm.
because if you do, you're going to get sort of canceled in the contemporary vernacular.
Hmm.
I mean, you know, growing up, I think that's hard to imagine. Nobody would even have thought that was possible.
Hmm.
Um, but here we are.
Indeed.
So,
What do you think comes next? What do you think is a, a practical move for a person who's grappling with this right now? What can we do?
um, well, You mean just any old person or a therapist or?
Yeah, yeah, well, I guess either if you have any thoughts, just if you're somebody who's concerned but don't really know what to do about it. What do you think?
Ask questions.
Mhm.
You know, uh, get a second opinion. Just like and I think too, if you're a person of a more liberal disposition who is not necessarily interested in the more woke side of things, or whatever your disposition, I kind of count liberal as a sort of generic term that encompasses both liberals and most conservatives, frankly. Um, but you know, ask questions of people, and don't be afraid to believe what you believe and value what you value. And just because somebody's got a degree or a bunch of letters after their name, don't necessarily take everything they say at face value.
Mhm.
You know, they know what they know, um, but they're not omniscient, and they're
Mhm.
not necessarily unmotivated. So, you know, ask questions and know that you have a right to do that. It's kind of the same thing you tell somebody going to the doctor's office.
Mhm.
You know, if they write you a prescription for a drug, ask them why,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
make sure you know before you leave the room.
Well, that's great advice.
Yeah.
So, any recommendations, or are you anywhere writing online or doing anything where you'd like to direct people to find more of your thoughts?
Um, Not quite yet.
Okay.
Um, but I do have some ideas about putting some stuff online um, in a relatively near future.
Okay.
Um, so, yeah, more to come on that.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, James, it's been really great to speak with you. I really appreciate your thoughtful observations and analysis, and it's a great conversation. So, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, Leslie. It was a real pleasure, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, I would love that. All right.